In the spring of 1945, an intelligence officer at the German High Command placed a photograph on the table in front of his colleagues and asked them quite seriously whether it could possibly be real. It showed a young woman lying on her back beneath the chassis of a heavy military lorry, a spanner in her hand, oil smeared across the sleeve of her uniform. The caption identified her as Second Subaltern Elizabeth Windsor of the Auxiliary Territorial Service. Everyone in that room knew exactly who Elizabeth Windsor really was. She was Princess Elizabeth, heir presumptive to the British throne, the future Queen of the United Kingdom. And, according to the British press, she was lying under an army truck in Surrey, fixing it with her own hands. What none of those officers knew yet was that this photograph was about to be tested, deliberately, by someone determined to find out whether it was real or fake. And the way that test played out would end up shaping how German intelligence saw the entire British royal family for the rest of the war. For men steeped in Nazi ideology, the image made no sense on its own terms. In their world, leadership meant distance, bunkers, motorcades, a careful separation between those who ruled and those who served. The idea that the future monarch of Britain would be sent to train as an army mechanic, would strip down engines and get her hands filthy alongside girls from factory towns and farming villages, seemed too absurd to be true. Goebbels's propaganda ministry had an easy explanation ready. It had to be staged. But staged photographs do not survive close scrutiny, and someone in Berlin was about to give this one exactly that.
To understand how it got to this point, we need to go back a few weeks earlier to a private conversation inside Windsor Castle between King George VI and his 18-year-old daughter. By February 1945, Britain had been transformed by nearly 6 years of total war. Women were working in munitions factories, driving ambulances through bombed streets, manning anti-aircraft guns, ploughing fields, and serving across every branch of the auxiliary forces. Elizabeth had done her part too, but it had mostly been ceremonial, visiting troops, touring bombed neighborhoods, the occasional radio broadcast. For most of the war, that had been enough. By 1945, it was not enough for her. She went to her father and asked for the third time to join the ATS properly, not as an honorary colonel turning up for a photograph, but as an ordinary recruit, with a service number and a training schedule like everyone else. He had refused twice before, citing security concerns and the rather awkward question of what exactly you do with an heir to the throne if she fails her driving test. This time he agreed, but on one condition: no special treatment. Same training, same standards, same chance of being sent home if she could not keep up. What he did not tell her was that he intended to make absolutely certain that condition was real and not just something said to make her feel better. That intention would resurface a few weeks later in a way nobody at the training center saw coming.
On the 1st of March 1945, Second Subaltern Elizabeth Windsor, service number 230873, reported to No. 1 Mechanical Transport Training Centre in Camberley in Surrey. The Auxiliary Territorial Service had been training women to drive and maintain military vehicles since 1938, and by 1945, over 200,000 women were serving in it. The mechanical transport section dealt with engines, gearboxes, carburetors, and a great deal of time spent flat on your back under a vehicle, with grease running down your arms. Elizabeth's training group had 24 other recruits, daughters of factory workers, shopkeepers, and farmers from across the country. Their instructor, Sergeant Major Wallace, told them on the first day that everyone in the room was the same, that some of them would not make it through, and that there would be no shortcuts for anyone. He had no idea at that point just how literally that statement was about to be tested, and not by him. For the first few days, the other recruits were visibly unsure how to behave around her. Nobody quite knew whether to call her Ma'am, Elizabeth, or nothing at all. That awkwardness disappeared faster than anyone expected, because engine grease has a way of leveling things out. One of her fellow trainees, a girl from Manchester named Joan, later said that within 2 weeks the princess was simply another mechanic with black fingernails, asking about carburetor settings the same as anyone else. The only thing that reminded you who she was, Joan said, was when a photographer occasionally turned up. Those photographers were part of the reason what happened next mattered so much, because the world was watching, and not everyone watching was convinced. That includes, it turns out, members of her own family.
A few weeks into the course, with Elizabeth roughly midway through her training, King George VI made an unannounced visit to Camberley. Officially, it was described as a routine inspection, the kind of visit a monarch might pay to any unit. Unofficially, the king had a more specific purpose. He wanted to know for himself whether his daughter's training was real, or whether the instructors were quietly going easier on her than they let on. So he asked for one of the vehicles Elizabeth had been working on to be brought out, and for its spark plugs to be removed without her knowledge, right before she was due to demonstrate a repair in front of him. If the training had been theatre dressed up for the cameras, this was the moment it would fall apart, a vehicle that would not start in front of the king with photographers present and a princess with no real mechanical knowledge standing next to it. What actually happened was rather less dramatic and far more telling. Elizabeth went through her checks, found the engine would not fire, and worked through the problem the way she had been trained to. Ignition, fuel, then the plugs themselves. She found them missing within minutes, replaced them correctly, and the engine started on the first attempt. Sergeant Major Wallace, who had not been told about the King's test in advance either, apparently found the whole thing rather amusing once he realized what had happened. The King said very little about it at the time, but word of it spread quietly through the training centre, and from that point on, nobody, including the other recruits, had any doubts about whether the princess's training was the genuine article. This is where the story stops being about a training exercise and starts becoming a problem for German intelligence, because they had been watching the royal family for years, and this fit a pattern they could not explain away. German intelligence had been tracking the British royal family's wartime conduct because it kept undermining a core piece of Nazi propaganda. The official line in Germany was that democracies were soft, that their leaders were detached from ordinary suffering, and that when the bombs fell on London, the British elite would run for safety while ordinary people paid the price. King George VI had spent the entire Blitz proving that line wrong. He refused to leave London even after Buckingham Palace was bombed 9 times, and spent his days touring bombed streets so people could see him among the wreckage. His wife, later the Queen Mother, said after the palace was hit that she was almost glad of it, because now she felt she could look the people of the East End in the face. The pattern continued through the family. Prince Philip, who Elizabeth would later marry, was a Royal Navy officer who had already seen action at the Battle of Cape Matapan. The King's own brother, the Duke of Kent, had been killed in 1942 when his aircraft crashed during an operational flight in Scotland. By 1945, German intelligence had a thick file on the British royal family, and every entry pointed the same way. These people were not hiding. So when reports began arriving describing Princess Elizabeth's ATS training, officers in Berlin initially assumed this had to be the one exception, the one piece of pure theatre in an otherwise consistent pattern. That assumption did not survive contact with the details. Her training schedule, the names of her instructors, eyewitness accounts from other recruits, and eventually some version of the spark plug story itself all reached German hands, not as polished intelligence, but through the kind of messy second-hand channel that intelligence often actually travels through. A German officer captured in April 1945 and held at a POW camp in Yorkshire later recalled being shown a British newspaper by one of the camp guards. It carried the photograph of the princess working on a truck engine, along with a description of the king's surprise inspection. The prisoner remembered not believing it until a guard simply told him it was true, that she had trained for months, qualified the same as anyone else, and had passed an unannounced test set by her own father. POW camp letters and reports were routinely reviewed by both sides, and stories like this one had a way of traveling back through exactly that kind of route, arriving in Berlin not as a confirmed report, but as a rumor intelligence officers could not quite dismiss either. By the final months of the war, German officers were receiving multiple independent versions of the same basic fact, that the future Queen of Britain had trained as a mechanic, had been tested for real by her own father, and had passed. One senior officer reviewing these reports is said to have remarked that the British king walked through the ruins of London to see his people while his own daughter repaired army trucks, and that German leadership, by contrast, gave its orders from underground bunkers, far from anything the people were suffering. He reportedly added that this was exactly why Britain would never surrender, because its leaders actually led. Back at Camberley, Elizabeth still had to finish the course, and it did not get any easier just because the king had paid a visit. Her engine timing was off in the third week, and she had to do it again until it was right. She failed her first night driving test for misjudging the gap between two vehicles in the dark and had to retake it the following week. None of it was smoothed over. She completed her training in April 1945, passing both the written and practical exams with a result that placed her solidly in the middle of her group of 24, 17 of whom qualified. Not at the top, not at the bottom, just competent, which was exactly what she had hoped for.
A few weeks later, on the 8th of May 1945, came VE Day. That evening, Elizabeth and her sister Margaret slipped out of Buckingham Palace with a small group of guards and joined the crowd celebrating in London. For a few hours, nobody around them knew who they were. Years later, she would call it one of the most memorable nights of her life, because for once she was part of the crowd rather than separate from it. The skills from Camberley stayed with her for the rest of her life. As Queen, she would occasionally surprise officials by diagnosing a mechanical fault that had stumped everyone else, and there are accounts of her helping a farmer near Balmoral get a broken-down Land Rover running again decades later, to his complete astonishment. It was never a costume worn for a few months and put away. It had been tested deliberately by her own father when the stakes were a king's reputation and an enemy's propaganda machine, and it had held up. And that is the real answer to the question those German officers asked when they first saw the photograph. Was it real? By the end of the war, the evidence reaching Berlin said yes, not because the British press said so, but because the one man with every reason to find out for certain, her own father, had quietly arranged a test nobody warned her about, and she had passed it without knowing she was even being tested. It is worth pausing on just how unusual that really was. Across the rest of Europe, royal families who remained in their countries during the war mostly retreated into ceremonial roles, kept far from anything resembling actual service, let alone manual labor. Even among Britain's allies, the idea of a future head of state being sent through a standard military training course with the genuine possibility of failing it had no real precedent. Most royal households would have considered the risk alone, the risk of an heir to the throne being photographed failing a driving test or struggling visibly with an engine, far too dangerous to allow. The fact that King George VI not only allowed it, but actively tested whether it was genuine, says something about how differently the British monarchy had come to see its own role by 1945. It also set a precedent that outlasted the war by decades. When Elizabeth's own children came of age, none of them were offered purely ceremonial military titles and left at that. Her son trained and served in the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force in operational roles, flying helicopters during active conflict. Her grandchildren, generations later, served in Afghanistan, one of them as a frontline officer whose deployment had to be kept secret for his own safety in a war zone, not a parade ground. Whether or not any of them ever thought consciously about a princess fixing a lorry engine in Camberley in 1945, the standard she helped establish, that royal service had to be real or it was worth nothing at all, became part of how the institution defined itself going forward.
For the German officers studying that photograph in the spring of 1945, none of this future was visible yet. All they had was a picture, a caption, and a growing pile of reports that refused to let them dismiss it as propaganda. But in hindsight, that photograph was not really the end of anything. It was the first piece of evidence for a pattern that would continue for the rest of the century, in a royal family that had decided, almost by accident, that the only kind of service worth having was the kind that could fail.